Uh, I didn't really decide. I just got discovered for Terminator 2. I was hanging at this place.
Edward Furlong didn't vanish from Hollywood. He was slowly erased by it. At 13, he carried the future of cinema on his shoulders, not metaphorically, literally. The fate of humanity, the hope of an entire generation, written into a single teenage face. For a brief moment in the early 1990s, Edward Furlong wasn't just famous. He was essential, a symbol of youth, rebellion, and emotional truth inside a machine-driven blockbuster era. And then, almost without warning, he became a punchline. Tabloids reduced him to mugshots. Headlines turned his name into a cautionary phrase. Somewhere along the way, the boy who once represented the future was rewritten as a failure who couldn't handle success. The story hardened, the industry moved on, and the audience accepted a simplified explanation because it was easier than asking the uncomfortable question beneath it. What actually happens when a child is handed adult power, adult money, and adult expectations before they've developed an adult self? This is not a story about a single bad decision, or a single toxic relationship, or even addiction, though all of those exist here. This is a story about exposure without protection, about fame arriving before identity, about a system that celebrates discovery but rarely stays long enough to witness the damage it leaves behind. Edward Furlong's career didn't collapse in one dramatic moment. It fractured quietly, piece by piece, under pressures most people never face at any age, let alone before they're old enough to understand consent, control, or consequence. And by the time the world noticed something was wrong, the narrative had already been written without him. If stories like this interest you, the ones that live in the shadowed space between stardom and disappearance, you may want to subscribe to the Final Cut Stories. This channel explores cinematic lives with patience, restraint, and a willingness to sit with uncomfortable truths rather than rush past them. Because Edward Furlong's story isn't really about what went wrong, it's about what was never allowed to go right. Before Edward Furlong became famous, he was largely invisible. He grew up in a fractured environment where stability was inconsistent and authority figures shifted often. There was no long-term structure preparing him for public life. No gradual path toward confidence or self-definition. What he learned early instead was adaptability, how to read rooms, how to respond emotionally without fully understanding why. These are survival skills in childhood, but they become liabilities when amplified by fame. Furlong did not pursue acting out of ambition. He didn't train for it, study it, or imagine a future shaped by it. When the opportunity arrived, it wasn't the result of intention. It was interruption. A sudden redirection of a life that hadn't yet formed its own momentum. He was discovered, not developed, chosen, not prepared. Psychologically, this matters. Identity is something most people assemble gradually through trial, failure, and private correction. Furlong skipped that process. He was validated on a global scale before he understood what he was being validated for. Praise arrived before self-knowledge. Power arrived before boundaries. At the same time, he lacked consistent protection. Adults moved in and out of his orbit, some well-meaning, others less so. Lines between guidance, dependence, and control blurred early. Responsibility for his well-being was fragmented, often contested, and sometimes weaponized. Instead of learning autonomy, he learned negotiation. Instead of safety, he learned performance. This foundation shaped how Furlong later interacted with fame. Attention did not feel like reward. It felt like pressure. Approval did not feel stable. It felt conditional. And authority figures were not automatically trustworthy. They were something to be managed. By the time Hollywood entered his life, Edward Furlong wasn't a blank slate. He was a child already accustomed to instability, suddenly placed into a system that thrives on imbalance. The vulnerability wasn't created by fame. Fame simply exposed it. Edward Furlong's breakthrough was so sudden that it barely allowed him to exist before it defined him. When he appeared as John Connor, audiences didn't see a performance in the traditional sense. They saw recognition. a kind of raw, unfiltered authenticity that felt accidental rather than constructed. He wasn't acting like a future leader. He felt like one, angry, frightened, defiant, and emotionally exposed in ways that couldn't be trained into a child. Hollywood didn't read this as vulnerability, it read it as magic. Overnight, Furlong became the face of a generational shift. He wasn't polished. He wasn't theatrical. He was real in a way that contrasted sharply with the hyper-controlled machinery around him. That contrast made him unforgettable. It also made him impossible to replace. The industry quickly decided it had found something rare, and rarity invites possession. Awards followed. Media attention intensified, and a narrative formed almost immediately. Edward Furlong was positioned as the natural successor to a certain kind of male stardom. Sensitive but dangerous, emotional but defiant. The troubled youth with depth written across his face. It was a compelling image. It was also a trap. Behind that image was a child still trying to understand why strangers suddenly knew his name, why adults deferred to him financially but controlled him legally, why his face carried expectations he had never agreed to shoulder. Hollywood saw a long-term asset. The audience saw a star. Edward Furlong saw confusion disguised as opportunity. The breakthrough did not open doors gently. It kicked them in. And once inside, there was no space to pause, reflect, or recalibrate. Momentum took over. Projects followed. Interviews multiplied. And the version of Edward Furlong that existed in public quickly grew louder than the one still forming in private. This was the promise phase, the moment where everything seemed possible. But embedded within it was a quiet imbalance. The image was already ahead of the person, and history suggests that when that gap grows too wide, something eventually gives. Success narrowed Edward Furlong's world faster than it expanded it. After the breakthrough, the industry didn't ask who he wanted to become. It decided who he already was. He was cast as the troubled kid, the volatile son, the emotionally damaged outsider. Roles that echoed the same rawness audiences had responded to the first time, but offered little room to evolve beyond it. What had felt authentic began to feel repetitive, not because his talent diminished, but because the range he was allowed to explore quietly collapsed. Hollywood's expectations hardened early. He was valuable as long as he remained recognizable. Not reliable, but familiar. The system had no patience for adolescence as a process. It wanted consistency from someone who was still changing physically, emotionally, and psychologically. Growth, when it disrupted branding, was treated as risk. At the same time, control over his own life remained limited. Financial power sat in his name, but authority did not. Decisions were filtered through adults with competing interests, blurred boundaries, and unequal leverage. Work and personal life became entangled in ways that would have been destabilizing for an adult, let alone a teenager. The pressure wasn't loud, it was constant, a low, unrelenting hum of obligation. Public perception began to shift subtly. He was no longer the miraculous discovery. He was the difficult adolescent. The narrative adjusted without explanation. Moodiness became attitude. Confusion became irresponsibility. The industry that once praised his intensity now treated it as inconvenience. What made this period suffocating was not failure, but stagnation. There was no space to step back without being interpreted as falling off, no margin for error without consequence. Edward Furlong was boxed into a version of himself that had been created too early by too many people for too many reasons that had nothing to do with his long-term well-being. The freedom that success promised never arrived. And the longer it didn't, the more fragile the structure holding everything together became. The turning point in Edward Furlong's life didn't announce itself with a single headline. It emerged gradually through a convergence of forces that all pointed in the same direction. As adolescence gave way to early adulthood, the structures that had once controlled his life began to loosen. Legal protections faded, supervision weakened, and the expectations placed on him did not adjust to match his emotional readiness. For the first time, Edward Furlong was being asked to manage freedom without ever having learned how to build it. This is where cause and consequence intersected. The pressures that had been held at bay by authority now turned inward. Addiction didn't appear out of nowhere. It arrived as a coping mechanism, filling gaps left by instability, exploitation, and unresolved trauma. Substance use became a way to quiet noise that had been present since childhood, intensified by fame and never properly addressed. At the same time, the industry's patience ran out. Reliability became the new currency, and Furlong no longer fit the profile. Missed opportunities, legal trouble, and tabloid coverage reshaped his public image faster than any performance could repair it. The narrative hardened again, this time into something far less forgiving. What's important here is that nothing suddenly went wrong. The system didn't break. It worked exactly as designed. When the asset stopped performing predictably, it was replaced. When complexity interfered with efficiency, it was discarded. For Edward Furlong, this moment marked a permanent shift, not just in career trajectory, but in how he was perceived. The child prodigy became the cautionary tale. The nuance disappeared, context vanished, and what remained was a simplified explanation that allowed everyone else to move on. This was the point of no return, not because recovery was impossible, but because the story being told about him was no longer his to correct. After the turning point, Edward Furlong didn't fall out of Hollywood so much as drift beyond its attention span. The roles became smaller, sporadic, and quieter. Independent films, low-budget projects, appearances that arrived without momentum or follow-through. From the outside, it looked like disappearance. In reality, it was erosion. Each year took a little more distance from the version of him the industry had once invested in and offered very little in return. Legal troubles and addiction cycles further fragmented his life. Periods of sobriety were followed by relapse. Attempts at stability were interrupted by unresolved patterns that had never been addressed at their root. The public saw mugshots and court dates, but not the long stretches in between, where rebuilding quietly failed without witnesses. Hollywood, meanwhile, had rewritten its relationship with him. He was no longer seen as a lost investment, but as a risk. And risk, unlike scandal, does not generate interest, it generates avoidance. Casting conversations stopped happening. Opportunities no longer required rejection because they were never offered. What made this aftermath especially cruel was its slowness. There was no dramatic exile, no official end, just a gradual thinning of relevance until absence became normal. Edward Furlong became a name people remembered only when prompted. Usually was surprised that he was still alive, still working, still struggling. During this period, life narrowed. Survival replaced ambition. Repair replaced progress. The goal was no longer to reclaim a career, but to remain functional within a world that had long since stopped waiting. This was not the aftermath of failure. It was the long shadow of early success, stretching further than anyone expected and leaving very little light to stand in. Redefinition did not arrive for Edward Furlong as a breakthrough moment. It arrived quietly, through exhaustion. After years of cycling between visibility and collapse, something fundamental shifted. Not externally, but internally. The desire to reclaim what was lost began to fade, replaced by a more difficult question. What does a life look like when it is no longer organized around proving anything to anyone? Sobriety, when it finally began to hold, changed the scale of his world. Time slowed. Consequences became clearer, and for the first time since childhood, Edward Furlong was no longer being reacted to. He was choosing even if those choices were modest, imperfect, and largely unseen. Success stopped meaning return. It stopped meaning relevance. It stopped meaning retention. Instead, it became functional stability, being present, being accountable, repairing relationships that fame had strained or broken before he understood what they were worth. The absence of chaos became its own quiet achievement. Creatively, his relationship with acting shifted as well. Roles were no longer symbols of trajectory. They were moments, self-contained, finite, without expectation of escalation. There was no longer a future being projected onto him, and paradoxically, that gave him more room to exist honestly within the present. This phase of life didn't rewrite his public image, and it didn't need to. Redefinition wasn't about convincing the world he had changed. It was about no longer needing the world's permission to be something other than its cautionary memory. Edward Furlong did not rebuild a career in the way Hollywood understands rebuilding. He rebuilt a sense of authorship. Over his time, over his limits, over a life that had been hijacked before it was fully formed. And in that restraint, something rare happened. The noise receded enough for itself to finally emerge. Edward Furlong's story is uncomfortable because it refuses a clean moral. It doesn't resolve into triumph, and it doesn't settle neatly into tragedy either. Instead, it exposes something far more persistent: how fame distorts time when it arrives too early, and how Hollywood confuses discovery with responsibility. Furlong wasn't destroyed by one mistake or one weakness. He was shaped, accelerated, and then abandoned by a system that rarely accounts for development, only output. His legacy is not confined to a single iconic role. Even if that's where memory tends to stop, it lives in a larger question about childhood visibility, adult power, and the consequences of being celebrated before being protected. His life reminds us that talent can survive exploitation, but identity often cannot emerge unscathed from it. Hollywood prefers stories with clean arcs: rise, fall, comeback. Edward Furlong offers none of these cleanly. What he offers instead is a portrait of endurance without spectacle, of survival without applause, of a person who was never given the space to become who he might have been, yet still managed to become someone real. And perhaps that is the quiet truth beneath the headline question. What happened to Edward Furlong didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, through misaligned incentives, misplaced trust, and a culture that mistakes youth for resilience. The screen moved on, the audience moved on, but the human cost remained. If this story left you with questions rather than answers, that's appropriate. Some lives are not meant to be resolved, only understood more carefully. And if you have thoughts of your own, about fame, protection, or the price of being seen too soon, you're welcome to share them. These stories don't end when the credits roll. They linger long after the noise fades.